Hello, good morning, everyone. My name is Chris Mensing, a biologist with the United States Fish and Wildlife Service's Michigan Ecological Services Field Office in East Lansing, Michigan. I've been working with Kirtland's Warblers for 20 years, and I'm the services lead for Kirtland's Warbler. And I want to give a lot of thanks to Mike Petrucia and the Kirtland's Warbler Festival for inviting me to talk to all of you this morning. I'm sure most, if not all of you, have heard the Kirtland's Warbler story before. So instead, I want to provide you some information about how the Fish and Wildlife Service is continuing to work with Kirtland's Warbler and our partners, and how we are monitoring the species in a post-delisting world. And after decades of habitat management, research, and brown-headed cowbird control, commitments from the primary land management agencies, and the hard work of so many dedicated individuals, the Kirtland's Warbler was removed from the federal endangered species list in October 2019. Unlike most other species that have been delisted, and some say any other species that was delisted, Kirtland's warbler requires intensive ongoing management to ensure the species recovery. The jack pine forest must be cut and regenerated, and the threat of cowbird parasitism must be managed. Fortunately, the long-standing partnership and recovery program recognized this need early on and started to lay the framework for ensuring these programs would continue after delisting. The land management agencies developed a new Kirtland's Warbler breeding ground conservation plan to build on the decades of knowledge for what the bird requires on their breeding grounds, and efforts are underway to build a similar conservation plan that would cover the full life cycle of the species. The Michigan DNR, U.S. Forest Service, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service signed a memorandum of understanding that committed to managing for the species, regardless of the species' regulatory status. And this MOU was just recently renewed in early 2021. And finally, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Michigan DNR developed a memorandum of agreement and associated long-term fund that would provide resources to continue managing for brown-headed cowbirds as appropriate. And these efforts will continue to support the species' dramatic recovery and long-term conservation. Whenever the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service delists a species, the Endangered Species Act requires post-delisting monitoring to ensure that the species remains secure from the risk of extinction. This monitoring is often laid out in a post-delisting monitoring plan that is tailored to the species' individual biology and threats. The ESA requires the species to be monitored for a minimum of 5 years in cooperation with the states. At any state during the monitoring period, if the species status deteriorates through a substantial decline in the species or any increase of threats, measures can be made to halt the decline so that reproposing the species is not necessary. A specific Kirtland's Warbler post-delisting monitoring plan was prepared and published concurrently with the final delisting rule. It was developed with the Michigan DNR and U.S. Forest Service and went through a pre-review process. The monitoring plan highlights 4 focus areas: breeding population, brown-headed cowbird management, breeding habitat, and the species' full life cycle. We used information from the conservation plan, the agency MOU, the cowbird MOA, and information already presented during semi-annual conservation team meetings to build the specific metrics we felt needed to be monitored. And while the Act only requires 5 years of monitoring, we felt that the species' life history, specifically its dependence on the rotation of jack pine management and the lag time between reforestation and occupancy, the use of non-traditional habitat management techniques, and the brown-headed cowbird management necessitated extending the monitoring period to 2031. As I move through these focus areas in more detail, I'll often use the words we. The number of agencies, groups, and specific individuals involved in the Kirtland's Warbler recovery and conservation are too many to list in this short presentation. However, every one of them is integral to continuing this great conservation story, so only for brevity, I'll refer to all of them collectively. The first focus area is breeding population. Obviously, this is going to be the key metric that provides the most direct information on the status of Kirtland's Warbler. For decades, we conducted a full annual census of all potential Kirtland's Warbler nesting sites to get an accurate count of the number of singing males that we used as that surrogate for the Kirtland's Warbler population. However, that full census comes at a considerable cost, and we've determined that based on the species status, having periodic counts will provide us enough detail and frequently enough to accurately judge the status and trend of the population. So every other year, we're going to be monitoring the population in some sample representative of the species range and the population. And every 4 years, starting with this year in 2021, we will be doing a full census of the species. And as we move to a time where we'll be experimenting with alternate habitat regeneration techniques, we realize that just getting a measure of the bird's presence at a site might not provide us enough information. And so we're going to be looking at how long birds are using these sites, how soon they move into them, and also how productive they are, to ensure that these non-alternative habitat techniques, which I'll get into in a couple slides, are providing appropriate habitat for the species. For years, removing the threat of cowbird parasitism was the key factor in setting the right conditions that allowed the Kirtland's warbler population to expand. However, in recent years, we've realized that the cowbird population, and especially in northern lower Michigan, has declined to the point where trapping cowbirds is no longer necessary, and the Kirtland's warblers aren't facing the same threat of nest parasitism. However, we realize that that population may again increase, and that threat of parasitism may again return. Therefore, while we're not currently trapping cowbirds, we're going to continuing monitoring the population and preparing to reinitiate trapping if needed in the future. So annually, we're going to be talking about what that plan is for managing cowbirds, or setting the stage if we have to reinitiate in the future. Look at where those trap areas where cowbirds may have to be managed, and then using the breeding bird survey as a surrogate to understand kind of the general cowbird population trends that are occurring both locally and at a regional scale. However, without that suitable acreage of breeding habitat, none of those efforts will matter. We need thousands of acres of habitat to be available for nesting. Annual reforestation must occur. Unfortunately, the jack pine market fluctuates greatly, and it can be difficult to sell required acres. Foresters are always looking for ways to increase the value of jack pine product while still providing adequate Kirtland's warbler nesting habitat. And we may now are looking at ways to potentially increase red pine or oak with the jack pine, reducing jack pine densities, or even increasing rotation age. All these modifications from the quote traditional habitat management will require some additional monitoring to ensure these habitats are serving as productive Kirtland's warbler nesting areas. So we're going to be looking at the acres and stand details of how much habitat's being regenerated, what the current overall breeding habitat looks like across the landscape, and looking at that jack pine market, or are there other ways to look at adjacent harvest or regeneration or coordinating regeneration across agencies and land ownership. And finally, we are also concerned about potential impacts the bird might have and occur along the bird's full life cycle. The vast majority of recovery actions have been focused on their breeding grounds, but the bird spends more than 6 months on their breeding grounds or in migration. More than 6 months on their wintering grounds or in migration. Therefore, it's important to be looking at what's happening in the Bahamas and the parts in between to fully understand the health and status of Kirtland's warbler. While we do not have much in the way of specific actions or threats for those, we are committed to being focused on that and looking at those potential threats that might have impacts to birds in the future. We do know that on the wintering grounds, March rainfall does have an impact on how healthy those birds are when they return to Michigan. We're also looking at fruit availability and sea level rise and the potential impacts it might have on their wintering grounds, as well as migration information. Can we find where some of these stopover habitats are? Are there any specific areas the Kirtland's warbler needs? What's happening on the breeding grounds? Is there new forest health information on invasive species or forest pests that might have an impact to the Kirtland's warbler directly or on the jack pine habitats? And then again, new avian health information. Are there diseases or other things out there that might be impacting the birds? Presenting and sharing this information during our conservation team meetings is the ideal format, recognizing the importance of the group and its role in coordinating information and collaborating between agencies. The Kirtland's Warbler Conservation Team Steering Committee and various subcommittees will evaluate and discuss monitoring results, provide recommendations back to the conservation team and the agencies for discussion action if warranted. And again, these actions are designed to provide information to the Fish and Wildlife Service that verifies a species is remaining secure from the risk of extinction. We don't require formal written reports, but just want to ensure that these items are discussed and addressed appropriately. The links here will bring you to the Fish and Wildlife Service's main Kirtland Warbler page and to a copy of the post-delisting monitoring plan. Please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions on any of this, on the Kirtland's Warbler, the delisting process, or the monitoring of how it's being conducted out. Also, invite you to reach out to the conservation team. The meetings are always open to the public. If you want to get more involved with the Kirtland's Warbler conservation team, or the Kirtland's Warbler Alliance is also a great resource to get involved with, to be part of the whole Kirtland's Warbler team. So thank you so much for your time. And thanks again to Mike Petrucia and the rest of the Kirtland's Warbler Festival Committee. I hope you have a great rest of your day and weekend. Enjoy the rest of your virtual festival, and I hope that you'll all be able to come up soon to observe Kirtland's Warbler and explore northern Michigan or Wisconsin or the UP or Ontario for Kirtland's Warbler and the wonderful habitats we have out here. Thank you.